If I was to ask you right now, as a talent acquisition community, where you believe we are heading when in relations to ED&I, what would you say? Are we stagnating? Are we improving? Or are we going backwards? That and the entire topic of ED&I is what Jen and I discussed in this week's podcast. Here's what you've got coming up in the next 45 minutes.
Like a lot of people, both hiring managers, candidates, sort of the wider business outside of talent acquisition, don't enjoy recruitment. They find it stressful, they find it emotional. And I think when a team sort of understands that and has that driver to say, okay, as a team, we're not just recruiters, we're enablers, and we're going to make that journey better, more enjoyable, more streamlined for everybody, I think that's when you get your high performance. I think the worst thing you can do in employer branding or writing a job advert, for example, is say, we do this and we're really good at this. And I like to really scale that back and say, let's not tell the reader what their thoughts should be. Let's give them the evidence and then they can come up with that opinion themselves. And when you get that person in on day one, let's embed them into our culture as soon as possible. Whereas actually it doesn't have to be day one. It could be day minus 1 year when they first start seeing us on LinkedIn or on social media.
If you really pay close attention to this episode, you're going to get actionable insights in how you can go and create an ED&I agenda, how you can go use data to support that or to challenge. And then Jen even breaks down very, very specific examples of how they've done this in her current company. There is 3, 4, 5 examples where no longer are we just saying, go and create an agenda, go and look at data, and then leaving it at that. But we're showcasing exactly how you can go do it, what the next steps are. So you can go and try this inside your own business today if you're not already, or you can use it as an anchor to try something new. There are definitely 2, 3 examples that I've never heard of, never seen before speaking to Jen and her team. And I guarantee you probably might not have heard them either. I hope you get as much out of this as I did and enjoy the episode. And thank you so much for being part of it. Welcome to Tea Time with Talent Acquisition, the podcast aimed at fostering knowledge and sharing stories within the vibrant talent acquisition community. I'm your host, Eden, and for the next hour or so, I'm going to be joined by a passionate talent acquisition expert with a decade of transforming recruitment. With expertise in data-driven sourcing, ATS optimization, and ED&I, he's dedicated to empowering working mums, enhancing candidate experience, and shaping businesses using workforce planning. Now, as head of talent acquisition for one of the most successful schools that educate over 80,000 students a year, she's driving ED&I back into the talent acquisition roadmap for the very right reasons. So when you're ready, grab your favorite tea or coffee if you prefer, and join me in welcoming today's guest, Head of TA at BPP, Jen Hulme. So thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
No, I appreciate it. And like I said, before we click to record, I'm very transparent about the topics we go through. And the ED&I is kind of a topic that I hear a lot. People talk about it a lot. I see lots of posts around it. It's not something that I'm hugely kind of deep in. Obviously, you have to a certain level, but I'm curious to kind of see when we talk about kind of putting it back on the map, which is kind of where I said in the introduction, I'm curious to see kind of what you mean by that. But before we get into nitty gritty, I'd like to start each episode with the same question, as it were, the icebreaker. So from your perspective, Jen, what do you feel makes a high-performing talent acquisition team?
The clues in the title are diversity. And I don't just mean diversity in terms of protected characteristics, but I mean in sort of skill sets and ideas that people bring. And everyone needs to have that same driver, which is passion. And that's passion for the organisation that you're representing. But I think everybody needs to have that passion for the industry. To be a top performing team or a top performing individual, you have to have that care for advocating for candidates, that care for representing them and their journey, that care for representing hiring managers and making their life easier, and really sort of being that cog. Like a lot of people, both hiring managers, candidates, sort of the wider business outside of talent acquisition, don't enjoy recruitment. They find it stressful, they find it emotional. And I think when a team sort of understands that and has that driver to say, okay, as a team, we're not just recruiters, we're enablers, and we're going to make that journey better, more enjoyable, more streamlined for everybody, I think that's when you get your high performance.
That we're not just recruiters, we're enablers. I'm going to coin that for yourself, of course, but I'm definitely going to steal it at some point. But
You can
I
have it,
think you're
that's fine.
absolutely, I think you're absolutely right. I think that the point about stressful environments and things like of course, it all takes a toll at some point. There's only so much you can do. But you're absolutely right. I think the diverse aspect to make up a high performing team, having that passion and that awareness of why you're doing it in the first place, and then being able to come back to your quote unquote your why as a team. What is it you're trying to achieve? Obviously with diversity then. So ED&I, first of all, explain to me just in layman's terms what it actually is.
So there's two aspects. There's diversity and there's inclusivity. So diversity, looking at how diverse your organisation is, looking at how diverse your candidate pool is. And that's sort of from attraction right down to selection and different stages of a recruitment funnel as well. And there's lots and lots of statistics you can look about the benefits of having that diverse organisation. Inclusivity, diversity of thought, it drives more revenue, it drives more creativity. And I think you've already said kindly, been in the industry for 10 years for my sins. And when I started, it was very much focused around diversity. There's been a real shift because there's no point having a diverse talent pool, recruiting diverse candidates if you don't have inclusivity, because they're not going to stay. It almost becomes tokenism and it almost becomes a bit of a show and a tick box exercise of we're trying to be diverse. But if you're not creating that inclusive workforce at the end, there's no point having one without the other. So when you have that diverse workforce, how are you being inclusive and how are you creating that inclusive culture?
Yeah, I think that point, by the way, the inclusivity element, I think, is kind of really come in the last few years more so than anything. But I've seen it as well. The hiring managers would say, rightfully, wrongfully, however they want to, and not to throw anyone under the bus, but they'll say, "Can you find us more women?" Especially in software engineering. I'm like, okay, well, what does your team look like today? We're all middle-aged white men. I'm like, okay, so how are you going to change this perception? Because we can go find women, we can put them into a funnel, you might be able to offer someone there. But if they don't feel like they're inclusive and you've hit the nail on the head, tokenism, they're just going to quickly leave. And it's the undesirable effect. Where do you feel like as an industry we are around the topic of ED&I when we take a look at this right now? So we're recording tail end of 2024, about to go into 2025. Are we improving? Are we stagnating? Or are we going backwards around this topic?
I think it's just fallen off the agenda. And I think it used to be the hot topic of ED&I. You've said it already, women in tech. I've been in that meeting, you've been in that meeting. How do we get more women in tech? And it used to be top of the agenda. You'd go to all the recruitment talks, you'd look on LinkedIn, and everything was about ED&I. And it just seems to be overtaken. It's now all about AI and other areas that are really, really important still. But it's just not got that same point on the agenda. And I think for a lot of reasons. Number one, it's very, very difficult. It's an ongoing project. You can't just say, right, this quarter, I'm going to fix ED&I. It's ingrained and it's embedded and it's not easy. And sometimes you can be working and you don't see that impact and that return for a little while. But I think the cost of living is really difficult at the moment. Budgets are tight and investing in ED&I almost becomes a nice to have for businesses, which it isn't, and the facts are out there. And I think talent acquisition teams, HR teams, culture teams need to think about how they're repositioning that and really getting that return of investment and that commercial impact through of what we're doing.
Before we get into the position of how we reposition in that case, right? Taking it back there, so I think if we go back to like COVID, right, actually pre-COVID and just after, ED&I, you're right, it's hot topic. I went to the events. It was literally everyone was talking about. And you are absolutely right. Now all the events are AI. Therefore, does it show, or could it be just a hot trend at that point? Regardless of what the data's saying, because again, data does speak and it is perfect, right? And it is good in the sense of like it shows why the commercial impact is beneficial, which we'll go into. I am just mindful, however, though, that a trend, that's all TA people are seeing it as, and not an actual root problem.
Mm-hmm. It is. It's not an overnighter, and it's not. I could go into a bit more detail in a bit, but what I've done is I've looked at the 4 main work streams that we're doing in talent acquisition. And I thought all of those are ED&I. You wouldn't think they are. Like AI is ED&I, because what is the point of investing in AI and building AI into your process if your process isn't gender neutral, because you're training a robot to be biased. So every part of talent acquisition that you're doing has to have that underlying theme of ED&I. It's almost not its own pillar. It falls into everything.
So it's the umbrella part of it. And yeah, okay, now you've just said, I mean, you're absolutely right, because obviously with the AI elements, I hadn't thought about it personally around how you're training it, because of course we should be training any AI that we're putting into our business on our knowledge, not on somebody else's. But the knowledge is tainted with bias to begin with, which I don't think you can ever also get rid of bias completely. As much as we want to, recruitment, talent acquisition is fraught with bias, as much as we never want to say it is. So then obviously that's a completely different topic, I guess, when it gets to that. But the whole point of repositioning the ED&I, then how can we go about and do that? You know, what's kind of your, I guess, quote unquote proposal of doing something around that?
I think building that business case is really, really important. And I think everybody has been in that situation where, A, working out what you want to do, and then B, how do you get that across the line, are the 2 big blockers that you'll have in talent acquisition. Sorry, I like analogies. And I think if you think of having ED&I, a lot of companies don't have an ED&I agenda. And if you don't have one as talent acquisition, it's really difficult to say, right, what do I want to do? Because your biases then creep in. So if I was given that blank plate, I'm like, okay, let's recruit more working mums, because that's my bias, and that's my story and what I want to do well. And it almost becomes that all you can eat buffet of, okay, I can fix this, and we can do these awards, and we can do all these different things. And it's how do you then refine that from that all you can eat buffet into that targeted healthy meal? I don't know what analogy I'm going down here, but you get my point.
No, I'm here for it. I'm here for it. Keep going. I enjoy it. But no,
So
yeah, I get it. So instead of going broad, we can then go, okay, once we know what our gender is, we understand, okay, we're trying to target this because of this.
Yeah. So companies need to decide what they want to be known for, what they want to improve, and why. I'm very, very passionate about data, and data will normally give you that answer if you look deep enough. I'm very lucky at BPP. We have a diversity agenda. So we have a 10-point plan of what we're looking to achieve. That's fantastic, because then I can look at that, I can compare that with the data, and can see what we can do in order to drive that diversity. And I think looking at the data is another really, really important thing, because a lot of people again have bias, data bias it's called, and they'll look at their data already with an idea of what they want to do, but to actually sort of step back, I always get lots of people to look at data with me. I'm data geek. Most people in TA aren't. Most people in HR aren't. That's fine. So I looked at our systems analysts, for example, and other people in data analytics who can come in and look at our data with a different mindset, no agenda of saying this is what I want to fix, and look at where the real issues are. So my advice, if you are in a company who doesn't have that data, who doesn't have that diversity agenda, is that's a really, really powerful exercise to do. I just printed a report off our ATS. You could see the data, and I split it down into, start with what you want to start with, but I started with ethnicity, gender, age, neurodiversity. You can go as deep as you want. You can look at intersectionality afterwards, but as a starting point, did that, looked at recruitment. What does it look like at different parts of the funnel? So I did attraction, who was being shortlisted by talent acquisition, who's being selected for interview, who's being hired. And then I compared that with our HRS data, and it told a really telling story. And suddenly I'm like, okay, I'm not saying this is what I want to fix. I'm not saying let's do a returners program. I'm not saying let's look at veterans. I'm saying this is what the data is telling us we're doing well, and this is what the data is telling us we need to fix. And then when you're looking at your business cases, suddenly you've got all this evidence and all this data that you can translate to get that across the line. So, for example, one thing that we saw from this data is there's not actually a lot of discrimination from interview to hire. Like it's quite clean. Like the amount of people who are being selected to interview to hired, the ratio is really, really transparent. So it's like, okay, so unconscious bias isn't necessarily the biggest thing there. Unconscious bias was quite telling when people are picking those CVs. So people are being biased against our CVs rather than our people. Good to hear that it's not the people, but how do we fix that CV part? So that became our focus, and we'd use the data to back that up. We'd looked at different business areas of where there might be a bit more of an issue than others, and we looked at how can we then target unconscious bias training, and how can we target that specifically around CVs, or do we remove CVs, or do we look at anonymizing CVs for those areas, and then we can measure the impact we've had on there. So then again, if we're looking to put a business case into do anonymized CVs across the board, got that evidence of how it worked in the trial, and I've got that evidence of why we did that trial. So it's not just talking that language of let's try something new and let's try something different.
Yeah.
It's having that sort of commercial impact ready.
Big rabbit hole there. So let me just pull it back then. So you had an agenda. That agenda, was that created before you joined, or was you part of the process of creating that agenda?
So it's being created currently, and it's being created by my boss. So I've had an input, and I've had my say. But we have a people and cultures committee, which again I'm very lucky to have, because it's people, senior leadership, who can get decisions across the line for us, who can make decisions, who can give advice, which I think is again a really difficult bit. So that was being created now. So when I started, it was me, and that's when the data came into it, of saying, okay, how, until we have this agenda and until we have this direction, what am I going to do and why?
So we don't touch the data yet until we understand what our agenda is, what our goal is as a team or as a company when it comes to ED&I, what we're actually hoping to achieve, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we set that agenda. If somebody hasn't got one inside their organization, now's the chance to, I guess, voice it or find out if it's something on the strategy to do it. But we want to understand where we are as a business when it comes to ED&I, get that in writing. Then we go to our data. And obviously the data points you mentioned, ethnicity, gender, age, etc., etc. And we can go down whatever we want to go down, and we're trying to marry up what does our data say about what our agenda is. So the data is being driven by what the agenda is, not the agenda being driven by what the data says, right?
You can do it either way, or you can do it as a mixture of the two. I always say, if you've got your agenda and then you're using data to back that up, why is that your agenda? Because it might not necessarily be what your company needs, or it might not necessarily be.
Well, that was my thought process, right?
What was that? Sorry,
I was thinking, if that was my thought process, because then because you're obviously talking about a data bias, because I was thinking if you have an agenda, there's a good chance that data bias will creep in, and you're looking for data points that back your agenda up, and you can say, oh, brilliant, we wanted to hit this and we've already achieved it, great, let's go celebrate. Whereas in I don't know, to me, I'd be sitting there thinking, okay, let's go look at the data, let's understand what it says first, and then use that as a guide for our agenda. But I guess then the problem also comes in, and I guess now I'm going down a rabbit hole, is that you don't necessarily know what you're looking at or looking for properly. I guess you're just looking at data, and that I guess in its own has its own problems.
Yeah, and that's why I'm saying I've got a maths degree. I quite like looking at data. Although I do admit I don't do it every day, so I'm not an expert at this point. I've spent my life in talent acquisition, but that's why I get people who are data experts who can look at this data and can analyze it, and with my knowledge of TA can sort of sometimes you don't want to have that true reflection. You don't want to look in the mirror. So, for example, if I was looking at data, how would I even collect that report to start analysing? Because my biases are probably going to creep in. Like, I'll give you an example. I was looking at what the hiring managers were doing, and I wasn't even looking at what my team doing, because I was like, oh, that's almost shining a light on, we might have some issues. Whereas, you have to think about how you're building that report. My team are doing a great job. The ratio of who's applying to who's being filtered is fantastic, which is always good to hear. But if there wasn't, it's something that needs addressing. And I think that's another thing. Sometimes that reporting bias of even when you're building that report and what data sets you're using, you have to be really, really open to, this might not be the pretty picture that I want it to be.
I think as well, though, is that's the purpose of trying to make some inputs and putting it back on the map, as it were.
Mhm.
Regardless if it's ED&I or any other points of data that you're looking at, there's a problem for some reason for you to look at that data in the first place. And it's going to illuminate either within your team yourself, like the business, but it's the business. As long as it's betterment for the business, that's the focus. It should always be the focus.
Yeah.
So you've understood your data points. You've started to see areas maybe where things are going well, and you're starting
Mhm.
to highlight areas where maybe things aren't. And then obviously that then leads into how do we solve that problem, or how do we at least address that problem? And I think the example that you've just shared there is obviously about training and whatnot, about kind of not necessarily in the interview to hire process, but it's actually in the CV screening to interview
Mhm.
process, and trying to identify, okay, what are the ways that we can make that improve that process. So from your experience either at BBP or in former opportunities or companies that you worked at then, I guess what other kind of examples have you kind of had, or approaches, more creative strategies that you've had around this to help achieve your agenda? Because I think that one example of, I guess, anonymizing CVs, or removing CVs, I think it's quite a common one that I hear around this.
Mhm.
And I think even ATS systems now do that. Correct me if I'm wrong. Most now have a anonymization process in place. But is
Yeah.
there anything that you've kind of thought that's a bit out of the box, but it's worked really well, and we didn't expect it to maybe work as well as we thought it would?
I think the biggest thing for us, so I've got sort of 3 or 4 main things that we're doing.
Cool.
Maybe we wouldn't think they're related to ED, like workforce planning, for example. That's one of our big ED&I projects. So we've got sort of 4 main ones. The one that I found really effective is looking at our employer brand. Now,
Okay.
again, taking you back on the journey to when I started in recruitment or when I started in talent acquisition. Employer brand was very much about like marketing and, again, just throwing a bit of glitter at it almost. And we did some really good campaigns actually, making them sound like they weren't worthwhile. But it was all
I like
about
throw some glitter. Wasn't
throw
expecting
glitter
that.
on everything. You've got topless, you understand. Um, But yeah, it was all about these big campaigns that you could do, all branded merchandise. How can you get that out there in the community and talk about how great your company is? Whereas I
Yeah.
think there's also been a shift in how people brand themselves, and it's now very much authentic branding of don't worry about the perfect. Let's go for authentic, and let's go for employee-led content. And I think employee-led content is really, really important. I think the worst thing you can do in employer branding or writing a job advert, for example, is say, we do this and we're really good at this. And I like to really scale that back and say, let's not tell the reader what their thoughts should be. Let's give them the evidence, and then they can come up with that opinion themselves. So if we're looking at things, so if you look at our employer brand, if you look at some of the employee-led content that we do on LinkedIn, it's just about us, and it's about what we do and what our culture is and what it's like to be here. Different religious events that we celebrate, and then employees can, future employees, candidates, anyone, the market can look at that and say, okay, rather than them saying we believe in diversity, we're doing great things, they can see it and come up with that opinion for themselves. And I think that's been really, really powerful. And everyone talks about like culture and how important culture is. And when you get that person in on day one, let's embed them into our culture as soon as possible. Whereas actually it doesn't have to be day one. It could be day -1 year when they first start seeing us on LinkedIn or on social media.
Yeah.
And suddenly they get a really good feel for who we are as an organisation. And that's an authentic feel. That's not, here's some glitter and here's some really cool things that we're doing and here's some water bottles with our branding on it. And I think that scaling back of employer branding has been really, really powerful for our ED&I.
Just to jump in, so 2 points to mention on that. For
Mm-hmm.
your team, I've seen it firsthand. So, listeners, my other half works with Jen and BPP, and that's how this conversation even started to begin with. Paige, please don't kill me when I'm about to say this. Paige wasn't the best at posting on LinkedIn. She never really did it. She could recruit, but she wasn't active. And it's actually, I've seen it not just from her, but from your team as well. And I always see, obviously, I follow your team. I see posts go up, and you see, for example, Jimmy will share something about him and his family, what they were doing on the weekend, and then it kind of, there's always this subtle undertone of, okay, family orientated. And then same thing, obviously, I see with Paige, and So I see it with your team, and there's another team that I see it with. It's a company called Benchside. Sean Kennedy, former guest on the podcast, and he does it really well. And he said pretty much the same thing. ED&I, or branding, drives that because every time he posts, he's posting a story about either him or his team or someone within the organization, and then people start anchoring towards
Mhm.
that. So it's not embed them in the culture; they're already part of the culture because they already understand what we do. And
Yeah.
I think that's so powerful, and so many teams I think missed the mark on it because they think that it is just throw glitter, make it fancy, but you're losing the authenticity. But it is way easier when you have a team around you to do that. So my question to you is, how do you do that when you're in a very small organization, or maybe you're just a one man band or one woman band, as it were, in the recruitment team?
I think you can just start with you. I think a lot of people like Paige, and especially if you start looking at wider business outside of talent acquisition, there's a lot of nervousness of, right, I don't know what to say. I'm nervous. I don't know when to post. So I started rolling out a bit of training of how are you actually, like, what do you actually want to achieve? Like, what do you want to say? How do you define, like, what do you want to be known for? So I've got like 6 themes that I want to be known for. And I've sort of come up with them over time, and they're what I post about. And I've encouraged everyone in my team to do the same. And we also came up with some values of us as a talent acquisition team. Most companies have values anyway, so that's a good starting place if you're looking at then spreading it, which is what we're doing at the moment. We're starting with us. We're doing a bit of a trial. We're measuring the commercial impact of our posts because a lot of people will see our silly little LinkedIn posts and not really understand that. LinkedIn's great for data. So we've got a lot of facts. So like 66% of our hires so far this year have seen some of our employee-led content on LinkedIn before. So they know about our culture before they've joined us. And that could be before we've reached out to them. That could be by accident. That could be they followed our homepage or applied for a job as a result of seeing our content. That's a really, really high number.
Don't mind me asking, how do you understand that 66% saw the content first and then applied instead of applied and then saw the content?
Okay, that's fair. It could be either way. But before they've become employees, they've seen our content. But either way, even if they've already applied, it's that embedding of culture before they've started that's really, really powerful, because I haven't quite got the analytics to measure this yet, but I'm hoping seeing that culture and that early embedment of culture is going to have effect on our early attrition rates, because they know what it's like to work here. It's not going to be a big shock when they start.
Yeah, so you can hopefully backtrack the people that are 66%. Fingers crossed, we've got a much higher attrition rate. No, much higher passing probation, and then versus the 44% maybe that didn't see it.
Yeah,
I guess you could do that through employer-led surveys as well once they've started. But of course, probation passing 1 year anniversaries, they're probably the easiest thing to say. Okay, are we getting the return on investment that we had from that person, or we thought we was going to have from that person?
Yeah, exactly. And then the other thing we're measuring with our content is impressions as a team. So if you don't know, impressions are sort of the number of people who see your content. You can see on your LinkedIn homepage. So we did a bit of a session. We studied sort of some tips and tricks of the algorithm to increase our impressions. And then as a team, we could measure over time what our impression increase is. Now, our marketing team buy impressions. So I know what the commercial value of an impression is. So I can say, we've done this employee-led content. This is the impact it's had over 3 months. If we were to do this as paid marketing, this is what the cost would be. And suddenly it's not just nice LinkedIn posts. It's not like a nice to have. Same with ED&I. Sometimes it's seen as that nice, that extra, whereas actually we've put a commercial value on it. People can see the return. And then suddenly you have that buy-in across the business to say, well, I want to get my team involved. We talked to the sales team about it, and they're keen to do something different. So what we're looking to do is then roll that out to the whole business, almost have it as an advocacy model where we can really promote that. Now, we know that our business is not perfect, but it is very diverse. Like, we've got a lot of diverse students, and we then recruit our students. So we're doing really well in certain parts. So having more people on this scheme, not just talent acquisition, because I think we're quite diverse ethnicity. We're all quite young, for example. So I don't want people to go on LinkedIn and be like, oh, it's a really young team, I'm not going to fit in because I'm a little bit older. So the more people we can get involved, that bigger sample size, the more we can promote naturally what our organisation's like.
You mentioned 4 points in total, so that's one. If you don't mind sharing just one other that you, out of the 4 that you've experienced with more of the creative ideas.
Yeah, so I'll talk about workforce planning because that's a big one, and everyone in talent acquisition is doing workforce planning or trying to.
Should be doing it. Should be doing it.
Should be doing it. Got a couple of grey hairs from doing it myself. But that's a really, really powerful tool when it comes to ED&I, because a lot of the times ED&I falls to the bottom of the agenda. Let's talk about a single bit of recruitment, not ED&I overall, is time. Everyone is in a rush, everyone is emotional, your role becomes live, and that person, how many times do we hear as an industry, oh, I need someone who can start tomorrow? That's like, great, okay, so we're making bad decisions today.
That's the one I get.
Yesterday, yeah. And then suddenly, if it's taking the time to analyse what their team looks like currently, the current landscape, looking at the market, doing some market insights, it almost becomes, right, we'll worry about that in the next workforce planning meeting and let's just fill this role and do as fast as we can. Forget about diverse shortlists or sort of falls to the bottom of the agenda. But if you've got workforce planning, you've got the gift of time. So you can start looking at what is our diversity target and how can we put some targets in place in this. So if we know that somebody might be leaving in 6 months and they are a team full of, I'll flip it on its head because diversity works every way, team full of women, can we go to the market and target some men and see, is the market out there? And it doesn't have to be, we have to hire a man into that position because that might not be the best person for the job, but at least we can say we've gone out to the market, we've looked at different people and we've evidenced that maybe they're not the best person for the market, maybe they are, but we've tried. So we've done that and we've put some targets in place. We've looked at it with succession planning as well for senior leaders. We have targets of what our senior leadership team is going to look like in the next 5 years. And if our succession planning isn't replicating that, then how do we link that with workforce planning to look at the external market as well? So it's been a lot more tactical. Women in tech's not my background, tech recruitment, but everyone knows everyone wants women in tech. So, but why and where and how can you link that with looking at what's coming up and looking at who's on the market and being a bit more tactical with the gift of time. Workforce planning gives you that gift of time. So by integrating ED&I into a project that we're already doing, it's been very easy to then look at how we can make ED&I more of a strategy rather than just a doing good.
There's actually one example that I'd like to share from how I know your team. So listeners, again, I've seen the terms and conditions from what you have for external agencies. And one thing that was in there that really struck me, and I mentioned I spoke to you and I spoke to your team member about this because I've never seen it before apart from one other project I had. So 11 years in recruitment, one project I had shared, we want to hit these goals or we want to see a diverse talent pool like this. And that was in that wasn't in the terms and conditions, that was in a memorandum. So we agreed a scope of work and that's the scope of work we had. Your terms came through and there was actual specific goals that you wanted to see around different groups of individuals being represented. And that, I think that, I'm not saying it's the right or wrong way. I'm just saying it was a very interesting perception to say, okay, you're actually taking this seriously. And that's where, when we started speaking more about this podcast, that's when it clicked for me to say, or to think, okay, this isn't just a nice to have, let's just make ourselves look good to the market, but this is actually being deeply ingrained into your organization. So I'd actually consider this with anyone who's interested in working with agencies to look at those terms and conditions and see, do they have that embedded in theirs or can we embed it in there somehow? Just have an open discussion around it because you want to be making sure that even if it's not your internal team, your external team also needs to be representing what your values are. And if you're valuing ED&I and that is a driver for you, they need to be on board with that. And if they're not, it's not the right team for you. So I think that, like I said, that stood out to me as a very creative way that you're trying to ensure that all avenues of how talent's coming into your organization through your employer branding efforts, for your internal team, for your hiring managers, and for external partners, it's all aligned to the same strategic business goal. So hats off to you and the team, whoever initiated that, if it was yourself or somebody else. That is, like I said, probably one of the most creative ways I've seen it around this topic.
That's good to know, because that was one on my list. And I think
Nice.
agencies specifically are, like, when used well, are a partnership. They're an extension of your talent acquisition team, and it is almost a bit of a blind spot because they're representing you in the market. You've normally gone to that agency because they know that industry very well, and they normally know that industry well, better than you know it yourself, and that's why you've outsourced it. But they don't know your culture better than you. So when you outsource to an agency, my thoughts are, who do we know, who have we worked with, and who can represent us in the market? Not just say good things about BPP and, you know, what we're doing, but who can really get across our culture. And that is that ingrained culture from before day one. And to have an agency who's got the same values as you, or at least knows your values, is really, really important. So we just retendered our PSL, and a lot of things we were asking in our tender review was, what are you doing for ED&I? Like, how are you improving ED&I in your hires? And it was really interesting because some agencies were like, we're doing this, and this is lovely. And some sort of saw it as a bit of a surprise question, like a curveball. So it was really interesting to see sort of that balance. And you want the roles, like we outsource about 10% of our roles, like that's 10% of our roles that aren't being represented by our culture if we're not choosing the right partners and they don't understand what we're looking to achieve. So we did that. We did the same for our job boards, and we looked at, okay, we're paying a lot of money for advertising. Are we doing it in the right ways? And are we doing it in ways that are going to attract diverse talent? And can they give us that click-through rate and that evidence? Or can we look at who we've hired and where they've come from? Or are there any more niche job boards that might attract different characteristics that we can look at investing in? So we did that project. We looked at sort of the return of investment. We looked at our previous agencies we've worked for, who they've hired. Is that reflective of the market? Obviously, we can't do it as simple as we want 50-50 shortlist because the market doesn't determine that. But can we see that there's steps being made to represent as well in the market?
The easiest way to understand those steps, because I've been thinking more about this as well now, and obviously part of our process is that we track what we do. You know, I think that because you're absolutely right. We externals are an extension, and if you know, it shouldn't just be transactional. So the data we obtain, it's your data essentially. That's the way I see it. So we track who we target, you know, how we're targeting them, response rates, rejection rates, that sort of thing. So in theory, you should be able to ask your recruiter, give me an update on your talent pool. Like what is the percentage between men and women are? What are the percentage of ethnic backgrounds? Things like that. And they should be able to do that with their own data set that's unique to that company, that role at each point. But that is, you know, that's how it should be, but it's not how it is all the time, of course. Sometimes you do need that person quicker, and you can't go through all that depending on what the need of the business. But workforce planning, circling back to that, if it's done correctly, should mitigate most of that yesterday hires. Jen, I really appreciate you spending some time and going through all this. If someone wants to take this conversation further with you, because I know this is, you know, something that you're very passionate about, and like I said, seeing firsthand, it's clearly something that you guys are making very good steps towards. Where can they pick the conversation up further with you?
Absolutely. Just message me on LinkedIn, Jen Hulme. I'm more than happy to pick up a conversation.
Perfect. And I'll put your LinkedIn into bio. And hopefully by the time this goes live, no pressure, but hopefully by the time this goes live in the new year, we'll be saying congratulations with your team's award. Let's see. So it's next week we find out the results. So hopefully I'll also be sharing that as well at the same time. But thank you so much for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Brill, thanks very much.
Bye-bye.